The shovel hit hardwood on a Tuesday morning, and Irene Ellsworth realized she had been digging the wrong grave all along. She stood in the pale copper light of a New Mexico dawn, the year 1878 pressing down on the territory like a thumb on a bruise, and stared at the lid of the strongbox she had uncovered 3 feet beneath the packed earth of her late husband's property. Around her, the sage-scrub desert breathed its dry, ancient breath, and somewhere in the distant hills a coyote laughed at something only coyotes understood. Irene did not laugh. She wiped the sweat from her brow with the back of her wrist and looked at the box, and then she looked at the house behind her, the small, 2-room adobe she had inherited along with the debts, the whispers, and the rotting reputation of a man named Harold Ellsworth, who had been dead for 6 weeks and had not improved much in that time. She had started digging because she needed a root cellar. That was the plain and simple truth of it. The summer heat was coming in earnest, and she had preserves to store, and not a single neighbor within 4 miles who felt inclined to help a widow woman who had, according to popular opinion in the town of Caro Blanco, married a cheat and probably helped him do it. She had not helped Harold do anything except survive the experience of being married to him, and that had been labor enough. The box was locked. Of course it was locked. Irene sat on the edge of her excavation and pulled her knees to her chest and thought about this for a long moment. Then she climbed back out of the hole, went to the shed, came back with a short-handled hatchet, and went to work on the lock with the patience of a woman who had learned that most problems responded eventually to quiet, persistent force. She was still working at it when she heard the horse. The sound came from the road that ran along the eastern edge of her property, a sound of single hooves moving slowly, not at a trot, not at a lope, but at the labored walk of an animal that had been pushed past its best comfort. Irene straightened and shaded her eyes. The rider came into view along the fence line, a tall man on a roan horse that had seen better decades, and even from a distance she could read the particular quality of his slump, not lazy, but exhausted in a way that went deeper than the body, the kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying something invisible for too long. He stopped at her gate. He looked at her across the distance of 20 yards, and she looked back at him, and neither of them spoke for a moment that stretched like taffy in the morning heat. "You the Ellsworth widow," he called. "I am," she said, "and you are trespassing on her property." He removed his hat. He was perhaps 30, 32 at the outer edge, with dark hair that wanted cutting and a jaw that wanted a razor, and eyes the color of old creek water, that particular gray-green that shifts depending on what the light is doing. He was not handsome in any manner that a society illustrator would have rushed to capture, but there was a quality about his face that made you want to keep looking at it, the way you keep looking at a landscape that doesn't announce its beauty but simply possesses it. "Gilbert Winslow," he said, "I've got a letter of introduction from Judge Harlan Beaumont in Santa Fe if you care to see it. I was told you had land for hire. Hire or sale? Hire to start. I need somewhere to be for a while." Irene looked at him another moment, then looked at the strongbox in her hole, then back at him. "Ride around to the hitching post. I'll hear your letter, but I'm not stopping what I'm doing on your account." He did as she said, which was the first thing he did that she approved of. By the time Gilbert Winslow had dismounted, looped his reins, and walked around to where she was working, Irene had the lock nearly defeated. She gave it one more sharp blow, and it came apart in 2 pieces, and she dropped both pieces on the ground beside the hole and reached in and lifted the lid. She heard the man stop walking behind her. She heard his breath catch. Inside the strongbox was money, a great deal of it in bound stacks, plus 3 land deeds she did not recognize, and a small leather journal. Irene stared at it all with the expression of a woman who has just confirmed a suspicion she had hoped very much to be wrong about. "That's a considerable find," Gilbert said carefully, from 2 paces behind her. "It's a considerable theft," she said. "My husband stole this money. I don't know from whom yet, but I intend to find out, and then I intend to give it back." She closed the lid. She stood up and turned around and faced him. Now, your letter." He produced it from his breast pocket, a folded square of paper, softened at the creases from much handling. Judge Beaumont's handwriting was precise and a little fussy, the handwriting of a man who considered penmanship a moral virtue. It said that Gilbert Winslow was a man of reliable character who had served for 4 years as a deputy marshal in the Cimarron district and was now seeking a quieter situation, having recently concluded the kind of business that left a man needing stillness. It said he was honest, capable with livestock and with tools, and that he paid his debts. It did not say what the business was that had concluded, and Irene noticed that omission the way you notice a missing tooth with your tongue. "What was the business?" she asked. He looked at the ground for a moment. "I buried my brother 8 weeks ago. He was the last of my family. I've been writing since, and I think I need to stop writing." Irene folded the letter precisely along its original creases and handed it back to him. She understood that kind of grief, not the fresh howling kind but the quiet after kind, when the world starts moving again around you and you haven't figured out yet how to move with it. "I have a bunk room," she said. "It's small. There's a good water well and the land is better than it looks. I need help with fence repair. The roof of the stable has a section that needs replacing, and I apparently now need to find out who my husband stole a strongbox from." She paused. "The wage is modest. The work is honest. I won't ask you about your brother if you won't ask me about Harold." "That seems fair," he said. "Good." She picked up the hatchet and the 2 pieces of broken lock. "Put your horse in the stable. There's oats in the bin on the left. I'll have coffee on in 20 minutes. She walked back to the house without looking back, because she had learned years ago that looking back invited a kind of hope that Harold had cured her of thoroughly. But she was aware, in the precise and involuntary way of a person who has been alone for a long time, of exactly how long his footsteps took to start moving toward the stable. They took about 4 seconds. She counted. The bunkroom was small in the way that the word small fails entirely to capture. It was a room that had been built for storing tack, and had been retrofitted with a rope frame bed and a single hook on the wall, and it smelled of old leather and the cedar chips Irene used to keep moths away. Gilbert set his saddlebags on the floor, sat on the edge of the bed to test it, found it adequate, and stayed there for a moment with his hands on his knees. He had not planned on stopping in Caro Blanco. He had not planned on much of anything since the morning he stood beside his brother Emmett's grave in a little cemetery outside of Cimarron, and felt the last of something go out of him. Not his will to live, not his strength, but his pride, the particular pride of a man who has always known exactly who he is and what he is for. Emmett had been the one who believed in things loudly, in justice and in law, and in the idea that a man could choose to be good in a world that made choosing otherwise considerably easier. Gilbert had been the quieter one, the steadier one, the one who did the difficult work without requiring anyone to notice him doing it. And he had been good at it. He had been the best deputy marshal the Cimarron district had ever produced, according to people whose opinions he respected. But when Emmett died, not violently, not heroically, but of the fever that had swept through the territory that winter, the fever that was perfectly democratic in its cruelty, Gilbert had found that the steady center of himself had gone somewhere he couldn't locate. He had finished out his term as deputy, and then he had stopped. He had handed in his badge with the same care he had maintained it, and he had ridden south with no destination more specific than away from everything I used to be. Judge Beaumont had been a friend of Emmett's, and when Gilbert passed through Santa Fe, Beaumont had pressed the letter of introduction on him with the quiet authority of a man who understood grief well enough to know that what it needs is not consolation but purpose. "Irene Ellsworth is a woman in a difficult situation," Beaumont had told him, pouring 2 generous measures of rye whiskey as the late afternoon light came gold through the office windows. "Her husband was not a good man, and he left her his debts and his reputation, and not much else. The town has largely decided that she's to be regarded with suspicion. She could use a reliable hand, and I suspect you could use somewhere to be." Gilbert had not argued. He had taken the letter and ridden south, and here he was, in a room the size of a generous closet, listening to the sound of Irene Ellsworth making coffee on the other side of a thin wall, and feeling, for the first time in 8 weeks, something that was not quite emptiness. He didn't examine the feeling. He got up and went to wash his face in the basin she had left by the door. The coffee was strong and good, the kind of coffee that is an act of self-respect rather than mere sustenance. Irene served it in 2 mismatched cups at a table that was clean as a conscience, and she put a plate of cornbread between them that had been made that morning, and she sat across from him with the strongbox on the table beside her and opened the leather journal. "Harold's handwriting," she said, not with sadness but with the neutral precision of an identification. "I recognize it from his ledger books. I am going to read this and determine who this money belongs to, and then you are going to help me figure out how to return it without getting either of us shot." Gilbert looked at her over his coffee cup. In the morning light inside the house, he could see her more clearly than he had in the yard. A woman of 28 or 29, he guessed, with dark auburn hair pulled back in a practical knot, with a small scar at the corner of her chin that she'd had long enough that it had become simply part of her face, with hands that were capable and unsentimental. She was not a fragile woman. She was not performing any kind of helpless widow grief for his benefit. She was simply dealing with what was in front of her. He had met very few people who could do that without flinching. "All right," he said. "Read." Harold Ellsworth's journal was not a confessional document. It was, rather, a record of transactions, amounts, dates, initials written in the brisk hand of a man who considered his crimes a form of commerce and did not feel particularly troubled by them. But if you read it carefully, and Irene read carefully, the shape of it emerged. Harold had been the go-between in a land swindle that had begun in 1874 and run until his death, in which 3 separate Navajo families had been pressured off their grazing land in the eastern part of the territory through a combination of forged documents and the casual menace of a man named Reston Drake, who apparently provided the menacing while Harold provided the paperwork. The land had been sold to an Eastern Railroad Survey Company for a handsome sum, of which Harold had taken his cut, which was now in the strongbox, and Drake had taken the rest, which was presumably wherever Drake kept his money. Irene read this and was quiet for a long time. "Those families," she said finally. "They won't have got anywhere to go back to," Gilbert said, reading the same page she was on. He had moved around to her side of the table without either of them noticing when it happened, drawn by the document's gravity. "The survey company will have filed on the land by now. But the money should go back to them. The money should, yes. The land is harder." He straightened up. "I know some of the Indian agents in this district. Served with a man named Carver at the Cimarron Agency. He's an honest man, which makes him unusual in that position. He might know where those families are now." Irene looked up at him. He was standing very close, and she was aware of it without being made uncomfortable by it, which was itself a notable thing. Harold had had a way of filling space that made you want to be elsewhere. Gilbert Winslow filled space the way good furniture does, solidly, usefully, without demanding your attention. "Write to him today," she said. "And don't let anyone in town know about this box yet. I don't know what friends Reston Drake has locally." "Does Drake live in Caro Blanco?" "He did until about a year ago. Then he moved his operations to Rosario Wells, which is 14 miles north." She closed the journal. "He came to Harold's funeral. He looked at me for a very long time." Gilbert's jaw tightened slightly. He moved back around to his side of the table and drank his coffee. "I'll write to Carver today. In the meantime, what else needs doing on this property?" Irene gave him a list. It took a while to get through it. The weeks that followed had the quality of a thing being built, steady and unannounced. The way a wall goes up brick by brick, and one morning you look at it and it's a wall. Gilbert worked from early morning to late evening with the concentrated industry of a man who had found that labor is the best available medicine for grief. And he worked well, not showily. not with the kind of demonstrated effort that is really a request for admiration, but with the quiet competence of someone who has done this kind of thing before and expects nothing for it but the satisfaction of having done it. The stable roof came first. He found the materials at the lumber yard in Caro Blanco. There was one, barely, operated by a man named Sutter who looked at Gilbert with the professional wariness that Caro Blanco apparently reserved for strangers, and he spent 3 days replacing the damaged section, with the patient attention to each plank that the job required. When it was done, the line of the roof was true and clean, and the roan horse and Irene's 2 mules settled into their stalls with the equine satisfaction of animals who no longer feel rain on their withers at night. The fence came next. The property line stretched for 3/4 of a mile on its eastern and southern edges, and significant portions of it had been let go by Harold, who had apparently considered property maintenance a matter for other people. Gilbert began at the southeastern corner and worked methodically, resetting posts, restringing wire, replacing the sections where the cedar had rotted through. Irene brought him water twice a day, and the first time she did it she simply left the bucket with a ladle and went back to whatever she was doing, and the second time she stayed for a few minutes and they talked about the fence line and where it might be better oriented, and by the 4th day she was staying for an hour and they were talking about everything except what neither of them wanted to talk about yet. She told him about growing up in Taos, the daughter of a schoolteacher father and a mother who had been born in Virginia, and who considered New Mexico territory a form of geographic exile she bore with resigned dignity. She told him how she had married Harold at 23, which had seemed a reasonable age for a reasonable match to a man who had appeared, on the evidence available at the time, to be a reasonable man. She told him about the years of noticing things, the money that appeared without explanation, the meetings Harold would not describe, the way certain men in town looked at him with a specific expression that was not quite respect, and the way she had learned to keep noticing without mentioning what she noticed, because mentioning it had consequences. She did not explain the consequences in detail, and Gilbert did not ask, but he filed the information in that careful place where he kept things that mattered. He told her about Emmett, not all of it, but some of it. He told her about growing up in the Cimarron Valley, the 2 of them the sons of a rancher who had died of a heart gone bad when they were still teenagers, leaving them the ranch and each other. He told her about the years of building the ranch up and then, when they were in their mid-20s, selling it so Emmett could go to law school and Gilbert could take the deputy's badge that was being offered. He told her about the particular relationship of older brothers and younger brothers, the way Emmett had always been the one who knew exactly what he thought about everything while Gilbert tended to understand things in a different register, through his hands, through the patterns of the world rather than the arguments about it. "You miss him every minute," Irene said one afternoon, not as a question. "Like a tooth," Gilbert said. "The absence of him is as present as he ever was." She understood that precisely, though the tooth she missed was not a person but a version of herself, the self she had been before Harold, the self that had believed in the fundamental navigability of life. In the evenings, if the work was done and the light was still good, they sat on the small covered porch that faced west, because the sunsets in that part of New Mexico territory in the spring of 1878 were the kind that made atheists uncertain. The sky went through colors that had no names in English and several that had no names at all, and they sat in the 2 wooden chairs Irene had put there for no particular reason she could now explain, and sometimes they talked and sometimes they didn't, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind, the kind that is only possible between people who have decided, without ceremony or announcement, that they trust each other. The letter from Agent Carver came in the 4th week. He knew of the families, they had been displaced, and were living in difficult circumstances at the edge of the Bosque Redondo territory, which had its own history of injustice that Carver did not describe in the letter, but that Gilbert knew well enough to make the information sit badly in his stomach. The long walk of the Navajo people had ended only a decade before, in 1868, when they were finally permitted to return to their homeland. And now here were three families who had returned only to be cheated off their land by men like Harold Ellsworth and Reston Drake, who had used the machinery of law and paper and recorded title to accomplish what older forms of cruelty had done more directly. Carver said he would help arrange the proper channels for the return of the money if it could be documented carefully. He said it would take time and would need to be done correctly to avoid the kind of legal complications that could tie everything up for years in a territorial court. Drake, Irene said, reading the letter at the table. Drake is the real problem. Harold's gone, but Drake is still active, and if he knows we have this box, he'll come for it. The money in it represents his profit too. He'll claim it was his. Let him try to claim it in court, Gilbert said. He won't go to court. Drake is not a court man. Gilbert was quiet for a moment. He had put aside the tools of law when he put aside his badge, and he was aware that he had made that decision deliberately. But some decisions, he was beginning to understand, have a shorter shelf life than you expect when you make them. I'll ride to Rosario Wells, he said, not as law. Just as a man who wants to see what Drake looks like now. You'll go alone, Irene said it quietly without inflection. It's reconnaissance, not confrontation. He met her eyes. I'll be back by nightfall. She held his gaze for a moment with an expression that was not quite worry and not quite the particular look a woman gives a man she has grown to care about, and therefore it was both of those things. Then she nodded. Be careful with yourself, she said, and turned back to the letter, and the ordinariness of the instruction was the most intimate thing she had said to him so far. He thought about it all the way to Rosario Wells. Rosario Wells was the kind of town that exists in the spaces between more legitimate things. A cluster of wood-frame buildings on a dry flat that someone had decided to call a town, because it had a well and a saloon, and apparently, Reston Drake. Gilbert rode in on a Thursday morning and took his time at the well, watering the roan and looking at the street with the unhurried patience of a man who has spent years learning to read the character of places. Drake was not hard to find, because Drake was the kind of man who ensures he is not hard to find. He held court in the saloon at a table by the window, a heavy-set man of 50 or so with the prosperous look of someone whose prosperousness has always been someone else's loss. He had two men with him, both of the hired muscle variety, both wearing the look of deliberate idleness that is actually a form of alertness. Gilbert had a single drink at the bar, exchanged the minimum necessary conversation with the barman, and left. He had seen enough. Drake knew the box existed. That much was clear from the way the barman's eyes had gone briefly careful when Gilbert mentioned being new in the area, just passing through, heading toward Caro Blanco. The reaction was too practiced to be spontaneous. Drake had primed him to watch for strangers moving toward Caro Blanco. Gilbert rode back at a moderate pace and let his mind work. He told Irene what he had seen that evening on the porch, and she listened with the focused attention she gave everything. And when he was finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "We need to move the box." Agreed. And we need Carver's process to move faster. I'll write again in the morning. And I think I should contact a territorial marshal I know, a man named Aldridge. He's based in Las Vegas, which is 3 days' ride, Irene said. I know where it is. I can send a wire from Caro Blanco. The telegraph office is operated by a man named Putnam who is friendly with at least 2 people I know Drake has had dealings with. Gilbert looked at her. You know a great deal about this town's web. I had 4 years to listen, she said quietly. Harold talked in his sleep sometimes, and men underestimate how much a wife hears. He felt again that distinct quality of admiration. Not the kind that is really condescension dressed up, not the "oh, how clever for a woman" kind, but the genuine recognition of a capable mind that had been working in difficult conditions for a long time. He felt it and did not know quite what to do with it, so he looked at the sunset instead, which was doing something extraordinary with purple and gold at that moment. "There's a telegraph station in San Marcos," he said after a while. 20 miles east. I could ride there." "I'll ride with you," she said immediately, and then, as if checking herself, "if you have no objection." "I have no objection," he said. "None at all." They rode to San Marcos 2 days later, leaving before sunup to make use of the cool morning hours. Irene rode her bay mare, which was called Patience with no irony whatsoever. It was the most reasonable horse Gilbert had ever encountered, with the settled demeanor of an animal that had worked through all its opinions about the world and arrived at equanimity. The roan, whose name was apparently Cass, had been somewhat competitive about this, and had required a few minutes of adjustment before settling into the companionable pace that Patience favored. They rode mostly in comfortable quiet, punctuated by conversation that came and went naturally, the way good conversation does when the people having it have stopped trying to impress each other and started simply being present. At some point around the second hour, when the sun was high enough to be warm but not yet punishing, Irene said, "Tell me something about yourself that you don't usually tell people." It was direct in the way she was direct about everything, without apology, simply curious. Gilbert considered the question honestly rather than deflecting it. "I used to write letters," he said. "Long ones. Not to anyone in particular at first. I'd write them and not send them, just as a way of understanding what I was thinking. Then Emmett found out about it and asked me to send them to him, and so I did, and he'd write back, and those letters were the closest thing to a real conversation I've ever had with another person." Irene was quiet for a moment. "Past tense. Do you still write them?" "I stopped when he died." It seemed he searched for the word. "Purposeless." "Maybe you should start again," she said. "The purpose of a thing doesn't have to be the person it goes to." He looked at her riding beside him in the early sunlight, her hat tilted against the light, her hands easy on the reins. "What don't you usually tell people?" he said. "That I was relieved," she said without hesitation, "when Harold died. The fever took him in 3 days and I nursed him properly. I did everything that was required, and when it was over I felt relief before I felt grief, and the grief when it came was mostly for the years I'd lost rather than for him." She paused. "That is not a thing a widow is supposed to say." "Probably not," Gilbert agreed, "but it seems honest." "It is entirely honest, and I'm tired of saying things that are not." They rode on. The telegraph office in San Marcos was operated by a young man named Flores, who was professionally incurious and efficient, both qualities Gilbert valued highly. The wire to Marshal Aldridge was brief, coded in the simple professional shorthand that law officers use when they don't want the wire's content to be casual reading, and Flores tapped it out without comment and said there might be a reply by late afternoon if Aldridge was in his office, which Flores gathered from no stated evidence was likely. They had time to fill. Irene bought supplies at the general store: flour, salt, a new tin of coffee that was better quality than Caro Blanco's only supplier carried, 2 bolts of plain fabric that she needed for practical purposes she did not specify. Gilbert found a small hardware shop and replaced the hatchet handle that had cracked under the lock-breaking work, and bought a new draw bolt for the shed door, and stood in the hardware shop for a long time looking at a display of good quality tools with the thoughtful expression of a man considering a future. They ate lunch at a small cafe run by a woman named Mrs. Gutierrez, who served them beans and rice and roasted chili in clay bowls with bread on the side, and the food was so good that they both ate in reverent silence for the first few minutes, which made Mrs. Gutierrez smile with the satisfaction of a craftsperson whose work is being properly appreciated. "Do you like to cook?" Irene asked him over the meal, and the question had that particular quality of domestic curiosity that is about something more than cooking. "Emmett was the cook," Gilbert said. "I can manage basic necessities without poisoning anyone. That's the full extent of it." "I like cooking," Irene said. It's one of the few things Harold never criticized me for, possibly because he liked to eat. I find it," she considered, "satisfying. The way making something real out of raw materials is satisfying." "Like fixing a roof," Gilbert said. "Exactly like that," she said, and smiled at him. And it was the first time he had seen her smile fully and without reservation, and it reorganized his understanding of her face in a way that took him a moment to absorb. He looked back at his bowl and ate his beans and thought about the fact that he had not, until this moment, fully understood how much of his attention she was occupying. The reply from Aldridge came at 4 in the afternoon. It was characteristically terse. Aldridge was a man of 8 words or fewer when possible, but clear. He would come. He would be in Caro Blanco within a week. He knew Drake by reputation and had been wanting a legal occasion. Gilbert folded the wire and put it in his pocket and went to find Irene, who was at the hardware shop looking at the tool display with the expression of a woman with a practical imagination. "Aldridge is coming," he told her. She looked up from a display of good-quality hand planes. "When?" "A week at most." "Then we have a week to be careful," she said. She put down the plane she'd been examining. "We should head back. If Drake has anyone watching the roads, he might. We took the east road out. We'll take the south road back." She nodded, practical as always, and they gathered their things and rode back to the property on the longer southern route as the afternoon came down toward evening, and the light across the desert plain went through all its usual performances of extraordinary beauty, and they rode in the comfortable quiet that had become, without either of them choosing it precisely, the natural state of being between them. They were perhaps 2 miles from the property when the trouble announced itself, in the form of 2 riders who appeared from behind a rock formation on the left side of the road and positioned themselves across the track with the relaxed menace of men who expect this sort of thing to go a particular way. Gilbert recognized one of the 2 from the saloon in Rosario Wells. He had the build of a man hired specifically for situations like this one. "Mrs. Ellsworth," the larger of the 2 said, with the exaggerated politeness that is actually its opposite. "Mr. Drake would like a word." "Mr. Drake can write me a letter," Irene said. Her voice was completely level. Gilbert noted this with appreciation. That wasn't quite the offer. Gilbert had placed his hand on the stock of the rifle in his saddle scabbard with the ease of a man who has done this kind of thing and has no interest in drama, but equally no intention of allowing a situation to develop at someone else's pace. "The lady has declined," he said. "That's the end of the conversation." The man looked at him with the re-evaluating expression of someone who has miscounted the difficulty level of a problem. He took in Gilbert's posture, the quality of his stillness, the rifle, and whatever it is that some men carry in their bearing that makes other men recalculate the arithmetic of confrontation. "We're just delivering a message," the second man said more carefully. "Delivered," Gilbert said. "Good evening." There was a long moment of assessment. Then both men pulled their horses aside and let the road clear. Gilbert and Irene rode through at a moderate pace, neither hurrying nor dawdling, and Gilbert watched his left periphery until they were well past the rock formation and the 2 riders had not followed. "You've done that before," Irene said when they were clear. "Yes," he said. "The badge." 4 years of it." She was quiet for a moment. "Thank you." "No need," he said. But he was aware that the words were not quite sufficient for what they were expressing. And so, apparently, was she, because she looked at him sideways in the last of the evening light with an expression that was new, one he hadn't seen on her before, a kind of careful opening, the way a door opens when someone on the other side of it wants to come in but is not yet sure of their welcome. He held her gaze for a moment, and then looked back at the road, and they rode home in a silence that was different from the earlier silences, warmer and more complicated. That night after supper, when the dishes were done and the last of the light was gone, and the desert was making all its nighttime sounds outside the window, Gilbert sat at the table with a piece of paper and wrote a letter. He wrote it for no particular recipient. He wrote about the light that day, and about the woman riding beside him in it, and about the way the grief of the last 8 weeks had been doing something different lately, not lifting exactly, but changing its shape, the way ice does in the first week of spring before it actually breaks up. He wrote for an hour and then he folded the letter and put it in his saddlebag and did not send it anywhere. But he felt, having written it, considerably more oriented in the world. The week before Aldridge arrived was the week in which something that had been building for a long time arrived at its moment of simple, unambiguous truth. It happened on a Wednesday evening. They had been in the yard after supper, Irene tending the kitchen garden she was establishing on the south side of the house. She had ambitions for tomatoes and squash and beans, and the ambition of it, the commitment to a future in a specific place, pleased Gilbert in a way he recognized as personal. And Gilbert had been replacing the shed door's draw bolt, and they had been talking across the 20 feet between them in the easy, intermittent way they had developed. Sentences that came and went and picked back up like a conversation in a comfortable room. And then Irene had said something funny about Harold's attempts at gardening, which had apparently been catastrophic in a way that was now available for humor. And Gilbert had laughed, a real laugh, the kind that lives in the chest rather than just the face, the kind he hadn't produced in 8 weeks, since before Emmett died, and Irene had heard it and stopped weeding and looked at him with such pure, uncomplicated pleasure at the sound of it that he had felt something shift in him with the finality of a keystone dropping into place. He set down the bolt and the wrench. He crossed the yard to where she was kneeling in the new-turned earth and he offered her his hand to help her up, which was ordinary enough. But when she was standing and they were close in the soft evening light, he didn't step back and she didn't step back, and the thing that had been building said what it had to say without either of them having to use a word. "Irene," he said. "Yes," she said. It was not an answer to a question. It was more fundamental than that. He touched her face first, the side of her cheek, where the last light was catching the auburn threads in her hair with the careful, wondering attention of a man who is aware that this moment will matter for the rest of his life. She leaned into it slightly, the way a plant turns toward available warmth, unconscious and complete. And then he kissed her gently, briefly, with none of the urgency he was actually feeling, because she deserved to be asked rather than assumed, and the asking in his touch was clear and the answer in hers was clearer. She pulled back an inch and looked at him with those careful dark eyes that missed nothing. "I am not," she began. "I don't move quickly in things like this. I want you to know that." "I know," he said. "I'm not going anywhere. You weren't planning on staying past the work being done. I've revised that plan." Something in her expression shifted the last guard, which was not coldness but the necessary caution of a woman who had loved unwisely once and knew exactly what it had cost her. She looked at him and read whatever was in his face with the precision she brought to everything, and apparently it passed her examination, because she took his hand and held it and said, simply, "All right then." They stood in the garden in the last of the light, holding hands in the dirt, and neither of them said anything else for a while, and it was the best conversation they had ever had. Marshall Aldridge arrived on a Saturday, which was not the day anyone expected him, because he was the kind of man who arrived when he arrived and considered predictability a professional liability. He was a lean, weathered man of 50 with a gray mustache, and the economy of motion of someone who has been doing difficult things in difficult country for a long time and has eliminated everything unnecessary. He shook Gilbert's hand and nodded at Irene with the respect of a man who recognized capability when he saw it, regardless of the packaging. He looked at the contents of the strongbox and at the journal and at Carver's letter and at the land deeds for a very long time without speaking. "Drake's been in our sights before," he said eventually. "Nothing we could make stick. This is different." "This is documentable," Gilbert agreed, "and the Ellsworth woman found it." "I found it," Irene said from across the table with mild precision. Aldridge looked at her. "Were you party to any of your husband's dealings?" "No. I'll need a sworn statement to that effect." "I'll write you as long a statement as you need," she said calmly. "I want this done correctly, not quickly. I want those families to actually receive what's owed them, and I want Drake in a position where he cannot simply ride to some other county and start over." Aldridge studied her for a moment. "You've thought about this carefully." "I've had nothing else to think about for 6 weeks," she said. He nodded. "All right, here's how we proceed." What followed was a week of organized, deliberate legal action that Aldridge managed with the efficiency of a man who had done this many times and knew exactly where every step could go wrong and how to prevent it. He sent wires to Santa Fe, to Judge Beaumont, and to the Indian Agency at Bosque Redondo. He arranged for a deputy from Las Vegas to ride to Rosario Wells with a warrant that had been properly signed and witnessed. He took Irene's sworn statement and Gilbert's, and he handled the documentary evidence with the care of someone who knew that evidence only does its work if it survives being challenged in court. Drake was arrested on a Thursday morning, quietly, before he had finished his breakfast. By all accounts, he was angry rather than surprised, which Aldridge said was the sign of a man who has always known this day was coming, and has simply been betting it wouldn't arrive on this particular Thursday. The legal process would take months. It always did in the territorial courts. But the warrant was solid, the evidence was documented, and Aldridge expressed confidence to Gilbert in the private manner of professionals discussing the likely outcome of a thing they don't want to promise publicly. On the evening after Drake's arrest, Gilbert and Irene sat on the porch and watched the sun do its usual extravagance of going down, and Irene held her coffee cup in both hands and said, "It's not finished legally." "No," Gilbert agreed, "but the worst of the danger is done. And the money." She was quiet for a moment. "Agent Carver says the process will take a few months more to properly transfer it through the right channels. He's filing the correct documentation." "He will," Gilbert said. "He's an honest man. It will be done right." Irene nodded slowly. The desert evening stretched out before them, enormous and quietly beautiful. "I have been thinking," she said. "About what specifically?" "About what this place becomes now." She was not looking at him, but at the middle distance where the last light was pooling on the sage flat. "Harold's debts are dischargeable. I've spoken with a lawyer in Santa Fe through Beaumont's introduction, and the property is legally mine without encumbrance once the estate is settled, which should be by summer. The land is genuinely good, better than Harold ever used it. There's underground water that I found when I was looking for a root cellar location, which is apparently what you find when you start digging at the wrong time of day in the wrong mood." Gilbert smiled. "And?" She turned and looked at him then full on with the directness that was one of the central facts of her character. "And I want to stay here. I want to build something here. The garden, eventually a proper root cellar, eventually more livestock, eventually." She paused. "I'm not sure what eventually, but I know I'm not going anywhere." "Neither am I," he said. "Gilbert," she set down her cup, "I want to be honest with you. I am not a woman who will do this casually or partially. I don't know how to be halfway about things that matter. If you stay, I would want you to stay with intention, not convenience." He had thought about this carefully. In the letter-writing way, he had always processed things that mattered. He had thought about it for weeks. He had thought about Emmett, who would have said, and he could hear Emmett's voice saying it, still, clearly, that staying still long enough to let something good happen is not weakness. It is wisdom. He had thought about the pride he had come here to bury. The pride of the man who doesn't need anything or anyone. The pride that is really fear dressed in confident clothing. The pride that had kept him riding past every place that might have become home until it ran out of road. He had buried it, quietly, sometime in the last several weeks. He hadn't marked the spot. It didn't seem to need a marker. "I sold the Cimarron Ranch years ago," he said. "I've been carrying what's left of it in those saddlebags. I have enough to contribute to a proper start here if you'd allow it. And I have skills that are useful." He stopped. He was not a man who said certain things easily, not because he didn't feel them, but because he had always believed that actions were the more reliable language. But Emmett would have told him that sometimes a woman needs to hear the words, not just see the evidence of them, and Emmett had been right about most things. "I love you," he said. "I know that's a considerable thing to say, and I know it's been a relatively short time, and I know you'll apply your own judgment to the weight of it. But it's true, and I think you deserve to have true things said to you clearly, because you've had enough of their opposite." Irene looked at him for a long, quiet moment, and her eyes were bright with something she was not quite going to let fall, because she was Irene and she had a certain pride of her own that was not the destructive kind but the sustaining kind, the kind that had kept her functional through 4 years of Harold and 6 weeks of managing his wreckage alone. "I love you too," she said. "I have for some time." I wasn't sure how to say it without sounding like a woman who falls too easily. "You are not that woman," he said. "Anyone can see you are very much not that woman." She laughed slightly. "No, I suppose not." He reached across and took her hand, and they sat with the comfortable, grounded ease of two people who have said the difficult thing and found it received. And the desert went from purple to dark around them, and the stars came out in that spectacular profusion that is one of the West's genuine compensations for everything it takes from you. 3 months later, on a bright September morning in 1878, Irene Ellsworth became Irene Winslow in the small church in Caro Blanco, in a ceremony conducted by Reverend Haskins, who was a decent man if somewhat verbose in his blessings. Judge Beaumont had ridden down from Santa Fe for the occasion, and gave a short, dry speech at the modest supper that followed that made everyone laugh and managed, in its characteristic Beaumont way, to be both humorous and genuinely moving. Agent Carver had sent a letter for the occasion, which Irene read privately, in which he told her that the 3 Navajo families had received the restored funds through the proper legal channels, and that the process of addressing the land claims was ongoing. It was imperfect justice. There was no way to fully repair what had been done, but it was real, and it was documented, and it was more than those families had received before. The letter was written with the careful, decent tone of a man who took seriously what he was trusted with, and Irene folded it and kept it. The property changed under their combined attention the way that land changes under the attention of people who love it, gradually, visibly, in ways that accumulate into a new character without replacing the old one. The kitchen garden that Irene had started in the spring became a genuine garden by autumn, with tomatoes and squash and beans, and by the following year, a herb section that made the house smell extraordinary on cooking days. Gilbert built the root cellar properly this time, with a door that sat true and steps that didn't buckle, and the preserves she put up filled it in satisfying rows by October. He built a second stable, larger than the first, because they had acquired 2 additional horses, sensible animals, purchased from a rancher east of town who was downsizing. And there was a plan, which they discussed at length during winter evenings, for a modest cattle operation, nothing dramatic, but the kind of sustainable, well-managed thing that grows steadily over years rather than booming and collapsing. He had taken a part-time arrangement with Marshall Aldridge, a consulting position that required him to ride to Las Vegas twice a year, and to be available as a reliable local contact in the Caro Blanco area. It was not the full badge again. He had not gone back to that, but it was a way of being useful to the work without being consumed by it, and it suited the life they were building. The town of Caro Blanco had revised its opinion of Irene, which took some time because revisions of civic opinion always do, but it happened. The facts of what she had done with the strongbox, finding it, documenting it, working to return what was stolen rather than simply keeping it, became known in the way that things become known in small towns, gradually and completely, and it shifted something in the way people looked at her when she rode into town. Not overnight. Nothing is overnight in a small town. But by winter, people were nodding to her on the street with the real nod rather than the civil one, and the woman who ran the dry goods, a Mrs. Tremblay who had been coolly polite for years, one day simply hugged Irene briefly and without explanation, which was its own kind of verdict. Drake's trial was held in the spring of 1879 in Santa Fe before Judge Beaumont's court. Gilbert testified. Irene's sworn statement was entered into evidence. Carver testified on behalf of the affected families. The trial took 3 days and the verdict took the jury 1 hour, which Aldridge said later was slightly longer than he'd expected, which told you something about the jury, but the outcome was correct. Drake was convicted on fraud, conspiracy, and a third charge related to the land documents, and he was sentenced to 7 years in the territorial prison, which was not as long as he deserved but was longer than he had expected, judging by his expression when the sentence was read. Irene sat in the gallery and heard the verdict with her hands folded in her lap and her face still and composed, and on the way out of the courthouse, Gilbert put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him briefly, and that was all the reaction either of them displayed in public, because that was their way, a privacy that was not coldness but its opposite, the warmth that belongs only to the people sharing it. In the carriage back to the hotel where they were staying in Santa Fe for the trial, Irene put her head on his shoulder and said, "It's done." "Most of it," he agreed. "Most of it," she accepted. "Enough of it." He pressed his lips to her hair. She smelled of the cedar soap she used and the clean, warm wool of her coat, and underneath both of those things simply herself. "What do you want to do tomorrow?" he asked. "Before we ride back, we could stay an extra day," she considered. "I'd like to visit the plaza and the market, and I'd like a good restaurant supper where we don't think about any of this." "That sounds exactly right," he said. They had that extra day in Santa Fe, walking the plaza in the spring sunshine, buying things they didn't need and some that they did, eating a long dinner at a restaurant that had a fireplace and candles on the tables, and wine that was better than anything Caro Blanco could provide. They talked about the cattle plan, and about the garden, and about a book Irene was reading and Gilbert had half-read before misplacing it. They talked about Emmett, because by now she knew him well enough to talk about Emmett naturally, and she had a way of referring to him that made him feel present in the conversation rather than simply mourned, which was a gift Gilbert had not expected. They rode home the following morning in the early cool, side by side on the familiar road, and the territory spread out around them in the vast, beautiful, difficult way it always did. This land that was ancient and still being decided, and nothing like simple. And Gilbert felt, riding beside his wife through the sage and the sunlight, that he was precisely where he had never known he was supposed to be until he found it. The cattle operation took shape over the following year and a half, and it was, as planned, modest and well-managed and increasingly productive. Gilbert's understanding of livestock was practical rather than theoretical, built on years of ranch work before the deputy years, and Irene's understanding of the financial side of running a small operation was sharp and careful, built on the unfortunate education of having watched Harold do everything wrong and having quietly figured out what right would look like. Together they were, as Beaumont observed when he visited in the autumn of 1879 and saw the state of the property, a more functional operation than he'd seen in much larger and better capitalized spreads. "You've done something real here," he said, standing in the yard and looking at the stable and the fencing and the kitchen garden and the clear evidence of a place that is genuinely cared for. "We're working at it," Gilbert said. "That's the whole of the secret," Beaumont said. The winter of 1879 was cold and clear, the kind of winter that is hard on livestock and beautiful to look at, with frost on the desert grass in the mornings and skies at night that were so dense with stars they looked almost material. Irene was pregnant by December, which she told Gilbert on a cold Tuesday evening by the fire with the same directness she brought to everything, and he sat very still for a moment processing this information, and then he said, "Are you well?" And she said she was perfectly well, and he said, "Good." And then he did something she had never seen him do. He put his face in his hands for a moment, not in distress but in the private overwhelming of a man who has been given something he did not know he was allowed to want. She went to him and put her arms around him, and he held on to her with the particular grip of someone holding something fragile and important, and they stayed like that for a while by the fire while the winter went about its business outside. Emmett would have been absurdly pleased, he said, his voice somewhat unsteady. Tell me what he would have said, she said. Gilbert laughed slightly, still not entirely in control of the laugh. He would have made a speech, a long one. It would have had at least 4 mentions of responsibility and probably one terrible joke about cattle ranching as a preparation for parenthood. He sounds wonderful, Irene said. He was, Gilbert said. He really was. She held him a little tighter. Then we'll tell this child about him, a lot, so he knows who his uncle was. He, Gilbert repeated. I have a feeling, she said. I could be wrong, but I have a feeling. She was not wrong. On a warm May morning in 1880, in the room that had been expanded over the winter with additional boards and a second window to admit the light, Irene gave birth to a boy with his father's gray-green eyes and his mother's determined expression, who announced himself to the world at considerable volume, and then settled into the business of existence with the focused intensity of someone who intends to take it seriously. They named him Emmett Harlan Winslow, Emmett for the obvious reason, and Harlan for Judge Beaumont, who was informed by letter and replied with 4 pages of genuine emotion, very skillfully disguised as jurisprudential reflection. Emmett Harlan was, from the beginning, the kind of child who makes you understand that some personalities are largely preformed and arrive complete. He was curious and vocal and deeply interested in the functioning of everything, and he learned to walk by following his father around the property at a determined toddle, studying everything Gilbert did with the close attention of someone taking notes. He was also, from very early on, inclined to follow his mother into the kitchen and the garden with equal dedication, which Irene found satisfying in the way that things are satisfying when they exceed your hopes. The property continued to develop. A second child arrived in the autumn of 1882, a girl this time, dark-haired where Emmett was light, watchful where he was vocal, who they named Clara Jane. She had Irene's precision and Gilbert's patience in a combination that seemed likely to make her either a judge or a saint, and possibly both. The town of Caro Blanco had, by this point, fully arrived at its revised opinion of both Winslows. Gilbert was known as a fair and capable man with a reliable judgment, someone who could be consulted when things went sideways, not because he sought that position, but because it found him. Irene ran, among other things, a small informal school on Wednesday and Friday afternoons for the children whose parents couldn't get them to the formal schoolhouse in the next town. She had her father's teacher's instincts, it turned out, and a particular gift for making the difficulty of learning feel like the pleasure it actually is. On a Sunday afternoon in the summer of 1883, which was a particularly beautiful summer, all golden light and manageable heat, Gilbert and Irene sat on the porch that he had rebuilt properly in the winter of 1879. It was larger now, with a good overhang that kept the worst of the afternoon sun off, and watched Emmett, who was 3, attempt to teach Clara, who was not quite 1 and therefore unable to be taught much of anything, the correct way to hold a stick. It was an unsuccessful tutorial but a vigorous one. He'll be a good teacher, Irene said, or a very persistent rancher, Gilbert said. The qualities overlap. She leaned against him slightly, the easy unconscious lean of people who have made a permanent accommodation of each other's presence. He put his arm around her. The desert afternoon stretched out before them, enormous and golden, the mountains in the distance carrying the last of the afternoon cloud, the sage flat between the house and the road shimmering in a heat that was beautiful rather than punishing. "Are you happy?" he asked. Not as a test, not anxiously, but with the simple, genuine curiosity of someone who cares about the answer and knows the person he's asking gives honest ones. She was quiet for a moment, not because she was uncertain, but because she was Irene and she thought before she spoke. "Yes," she said, "completely. In a way I didn't know I'd been missing because I'd never had it." She paused. "Are you?" "Yes," he said, no hesitation. She tilted her head to look up at him. The afternoon light was kind to both their faces. They were not young anymore. Not exactly. Both of them carried the particular quality of people who have been weathered by real things and emerged clear-eyed rather than bitter. She was 33 and he was 37, and between them they had enough history to understand what they had built, which made them value it in the precise way that things are valued when you know what they cost. "Good," she said. She settled back against him. Emmett, in the yard, had abandoned the tutorial and was now investigating a beetle with the full resources of his scientific attention. Clara had gotten hold of the stick he'd relinquished and was applying it to the porch rail with great energy and no particular purpose. "We should expand the south pasture next year," Gilbert said. "We should," she agreed. "And the water channel for the garden needs to be rerouted before the dry season." "I was thinking about that," he said. "If we run it from the north well rather than the south, it's a longer line but the elevation works better." "That's what I concluded as well," she said. They talked about it for a while, the practical talk of two people building something together over years, the kind of talk that sounds mundane from the outside, but is actually a form of love, the articulation of a shared future in the specific terms of things that need doing in a place you have both decided matters. The late afternoon went golden, and then amber, and then began its daily slide toward the extravagance of sunset. Clara had fallen asleep against the porch rail with the abrupt unconsciousness of very small children, still holding the stick. Emmett had found something new and was bringing it to show them, running with the wholehearted commitment that 3-year-olds bring to all locomotion. Gilbert reached out with his free arm to receive whatever Emmett was bringing him, which turned out to be a smooth, dark stone that Emmett had determined, with the confidence of a person not yet acquainted with his own fallibility, was remarkable. "Look, Papa," Emmett said, holding it up. "Very good," Gilbert said, turning it in his hand with genuine attention. "Good color." "I found it by the fence," Emmett said with the gravity of a field report. "Excellent place to look," Gilbert said seriously. He held it up so Irene could see it. She leaned forward and examined it with equal seriousness. "Very smooth," she said. "You have a good eye." Emmett received this assessment with deep satisfaction and went back to the yard, stone in hand, in search of further discoveries. Gilbert handed the stone back to Irene, who turned it over once more in her palm. It was a piece of dark river basalt, smoothed by water from wherever water had been before this land was what it was now, carried and deposited and found again by a small boy on a Sunday afternoon in the summer of 1883, which was the year the cattle reached the number they had originally projected, and the garden finally produced in surplus, and the south fence line ran true from corner to corner and needed no further repair. "I'm going to put this on the windowsill," Irene said, "of the stone, next to the ceramic pot Beaumont sent. He'd be pleased to know his gift is in such company," Gilbert said. She laughed. It was the real laugh, the one that had started in her chest, the one that had been getting freer and more frequent for 4 years. He loved that laugh specifically, had never tired of hearing it, suspected he never would. The sunset came on with its usual lack of modesty, filling the western sky with colors that had no business being as beautiful as they were, and they watched it the way they always did together, with Clara sleeping and Emmett discovering, and the desert doing what the desert always did, which was to be enormous and ancient and not particularly concerned with the small human dramas taking place inside it, but also. And this was the thing about this country that Gilbert had understood from the beginning, and that Irene had come to feel in her bones, not indifferent either. There was something in this landscape that received human presence, that held the mark of lives lived in it, that remembered water and forgave drought, and kept turning its face toward the light every morning with a constancy that was, if you were paying attention, a form of instruction. He had come here to bury the last of his pride. He had buried it quietly in the ordinary days of useful work and honest words, and a woman who had required him to be genuinely present rather than impressively capable. It lay somewhere under the south pasture, under the repaired fence line, under the good, clean work of a life built alongside someone who deserved it, and he did not miss it at all. She had been digging a different kind of grave when he arrived, the grave of Harold's legacy, the grave of someone else's crimes, the grave of a version of herself she was ready to be done with. She had buried all of it properly and well, with the thoroughness she brought to everything, and what had grown up afterward was not the tentative, provisional thing she had half expected, but something real and deeply rooted, the kind of thing that grows in good soil when two people decide to tend it. The last light went off the mountains. The stars began. "Come inside soon," Irene said, rising and lifting Clara, who shifted and murmured and settled back into sleep against her mother's shoulder with the complete trust of someone who has always been held securely. "I'll put her down and start supper." "Emmett," Gilbert called. "Coming, Papa," Emmett said, without turning, absorbed in the edge of something new. "Now, please." A small-scale sigh from across the yard. The small feet came trudging toward the porch with the resigned dignity of a very small person who has decided to be cooperative, but wants his cooperation acknowledged as a choice. Gilbert lifted him as he reached the steps, and Emmett curled against his father's shoulder with the same instinctive ease as his sister, and the four of them went inside as the desert dark came down, soft and enormous and full of stars, and the light in the window of the house in Caro Blanco burned steady and warm against it, the way lights do when the people inside them have finally, fully, come home. The supper that night was beans and roasted corn and the first of the summer squash from the garden, and it was excellent, and they ate it at the table where the strongbox had sat, which was now simply a table, a kitchen table in a home, with a stone on the windowsill next to a ceramic pot, and two children of varying degrees of consciousness, and two people who had found each other in the wreckage of other things and built, with patience and honesty and the stubborn faith of people who have learned what matters. Something that would last. Outside, the desert went on being itself, ancient and patient, holding the marks of everything that had happened in it and turning, as always, toward tomorrow.